We're now moving on to grouping values together. In this case, we have a variable called binding joints, and we have a supposed joint, center back 1 bind, and we're printing out that information. Nothing really that fancy, just prints out center back 0 and bind. But joint chains are typically made of more than one joint. So if I wanted to, I could say, well, let's say I had a couple of these joints. If I start using the same name binding joints, and I say this is 2, we do binding joints again, we're just overwriting that information on there. So even though we're using the same variable, we're not really getting anywhere, because at the end of the day, it's just going to print out what that last item is on here. Okay, well, you say, well, why can't I just come up with different names? Well, you definitely could. I can type binding joint 1 and put that information. Matter of fact, I can copy this down and just put 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we think we're like, this is good. Good. We can work with this. Well, we'll find out very quickly this is a problem. Okay, so if I save and run this, it works. See? That could be better formatted, but it works. Here's the issue. Is that enough bind joints? Well, if I have 7 joints, now I've got to create 7 variables. I've got to come up with unique names for every variable that's in there. That can be really a big problem. We might not know. Maybe the next joint chain only has 5 joints, or the next one has 20 joints. This is not a good method. This is going to run into a lot of problems. I'm going to comment this out. So instead, we refer to lists. Lists are groups of information. It's also called a data structure. It's a way of taking 3 values and associating them with one name. So in other words, if I instead in this case say binding joints, or actually let's go in here and name this explicitly. So we're talking back, let's call this back joints. And I do open and close hard brackets. This is what's called an empty list. There is no items in this list. If I print this out, it'll just give us hard brackets. But what if I want to actually create one that has components into it? Okay. Because, I mean, an empty list doesn't seem like it's that useful. So I say back joints. And in that hard brackets, instead, I'm going to take our values. I'm going to take our first name. And I'm just going to change the values in it. 2, 3, and then 4. There. So now if I refer to back joints, I'm referring to this entire joint chain. All of them together in one shot. You'll see this in translates, rotates, scales, RGB, UVs, XY. There's a lot of different types of coordinates that work in these groups as they come from it. And you'll see them in brackets. Sometimes you'll also see them in parentheses around the outside instead. This is what's referred to as a tuple. And I'm not going to get into too much details on the difference between a tuple and a list, but mainly is lists can add members to it, where tuples cannot. They're fixed. And that makes efficiency situations really nice, because if it doesn't have to adjust, it doesn't have those features into it. But you will see those interchangeable in Python. You'll see hard brackets and parentheses around the outside. Okay, well, that's cool. But most of the time when we're dealing with these, we want to access individual components. If I say print back joints, like that, and save it, let's see what it does. Okay. But how often am I referring to the entire joint chain? Most of the time, I'm actually padding maybe the first joint, or connecting the waist of the end of one joint chain to, another system, so to speak. So how can I access just this one? Well, that can be done by printing out. We can say back joints, and then in hard brackets, we put 0. This is the first index. Yes, starts counting at 0, so we're used to counting at 1 instead of 0, so this kind of messes everything up when you're speaking about them. But this is the first index. So how this works is index. There we go. So this is 0. This is 1. This is 2. And in this case, it's 3. So if I ask you how many components are in this list, or how big is this list, you'd say it's 4. Interesting thing here is because we start counting at 0, the length will always be 1 more than the last index. Okay, that's like, what? We'll get to that in a little bit. There's a command called len that you pass in a list, and it will return the size of the list. So if I print out, there we go. And that's its explicit purpose, to say, hey, this is how many items are in it, 4. So that in other programming languages, this is really required to find out what the last element of the list is. Also, when you're going to be looping through lists to do work on each item in a list, that's also really important. But nice thing is Python doesn't need this. You still need to know that command, but it's not as frequently used because there is a really, really awesome tool built into indexing where I could say print, and I say back joins, and instead of actually calculating and doing it, I can just say -1. That's a reverse index. It's counting backwards. So this would refer to, in this case, would be the center back bind. Now, you don't have to believe me for that. I could just save it and run it. Let's clear history and run. You see? Print out the back one. What if I wanted the second to last one? Well, I could just count backwards. That would be this one, and 4 would actually be the first one. Typically, I do 1 and go from there. This is actually in indexes. You'll also see really cool tools if you want to research further into this. You would research into lists and indexes, or index. Also, I suggest looking at slices and ranges. And this is allow you to get different ranges of values, like everything but the last item, or everything but the first item, and things like that. That's really, really, really cool. So that's literally dealing with strings and dealing with components on top of it. And a lot of components, when we get to later, a lot of commands are going to return groups of items because they might create multiple things, and you might need to fend through and grab the right things, like joint chains and creating different types of control icons, sometimes pass those back.